Salman. Half of the people are standing outside. Ali Hassan, close the lights outside.
Close the lights outside.
Yeah, because people are standing. They're not coming.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله الذي قصرت عن رؤيته أبصار الناظرين وعجزت عن نعته أوهام الباسطين الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين أبي القاسم محمد والبيت الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا أما بعد فقد قال الله تبارك وتعالى وقوله الحق وهو أصدق القائلين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم تبارك الذي بيده الملك وهو على كل شيء قدير الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا وهو العزيز الغفور. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Aziz Salah Salam Majlis, for the Chelum of SHERYAR HAIDER, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to elevate the status of Marhum, give him a place in the Jawar of Masumeen, and at the same time we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to continue to give solace and comfort and patience to the bereaved family for the loss that they have suffered. For this Chelum Majlis, I recited these initial ayat from Surah Al-Mulk, a very well-known surah of Quran. The initial ayat begin, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts by praising himself. He said, Tabarakalladhi. Babarakat is the dhat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Tabarakalladhi biyadihi al-mulk, in whose hands is the governance. وَهُوَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ. And indeed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is qadir and powerful over everything. The one الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا. The one who created maut and hayat, so that he may test you, ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا. Which one of you have best of the amal, best of the actions? And the ayah concludes, وَهُوَ الْعَزِيزُ الْغَفُورُ. Indeed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is almighty, ba'izzat, and all forgiving. Of course, the ayat of Quran, which in many cases are the tafsir and the tafsir of these ayat, and many such ayat of Quran that talk about the concept of death and the concept of maut and concept of life, are important for us to, not that all the other ayat are not important, but these are specifically important for us to ponder, contemplate, think about. Especially when Quran on numerous occasions tells us, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ فِي الْقُرْآنِ. You did not ponder over Quran. Many a time when this ayat is mentioned, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ فِي الْقُرْآنِ or أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنِ, it is referring to these ayat which talk about maut and hayat. If you look at Quran, all of its 600 plus pages, all of its 6,000 plus ayat, the majority of the discussion is about ma'ad and qiyamat. There's a possibility that every single page in Quran has a discussion on qiyamat. There's a possibility. There might be some pages which has more than one mention. But all in all, every page pretty much has a mention of qiyamat. If this was not the most important thing for us to take heed and lesson from, it would not have been the case that it is repeated so many times in Quran. Therefore, just to understand the context of these ayat that I recite for you, which you have heard many times, Tabarak alladhi biyadihi al-mulk. Barakat is the Zat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Just right here, pause for a second. What is Tabarak? We know that it comes from the root word Barakah or Mubarak. It is the masdar of this verb. But then this has gone in Bab Mufa'ala, Tabarakah. Definitely when this goes into different af'al, it changes the meaning.
Nature problem.
I'm not going to start the Arabic linguistics and the Sarf al-Nahr over here. But just the background. Some places in the Quran you have seen the word barakah and mubarak. For example, when you read about the nuzul of Quran, it says, Inna anzalnahu fi laylatin mubarakah. Right? We have revealed this Quran on the night of Barakat, night which is Barakah. Or when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the revelation in the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, بِبَكَّةَ مُبَارَكَةً أَوَّلَ بَيْتٍ وُضِعَ لِلنَّاسِ لَلَّذِي بِبَكَّةَ مُبَارَكَةً. The first place which became inhabitable for mankind was in Makkah, which is what? Mubarak. Or when you read about Hazrat Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, he was explaining himself, وَجَعَلَنِي مُبَارَكًا, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made me blessed, Mubarak. Here, there must be a difference. When Allah calls himself to be Mubarak or Barakat, when he calls other things or other individuals to be Mubarak, Barakat. So I gave you 3 examples. The city of Makkah is called Mubarak. Quran is revealed on the night which is Mubarak. And as well as Hazrat Isa Ruhullah is calling himself to be Mubarak. وَجَعَلَنِي مُبَارَكًا. Therefore we understand that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks of himself, تَبَارَكَ الَّذِي بِيَدِهِ الْمُلْكِ, or when he says, تَبَارَكَ اللَّهُ أَحْسَنُ الْخَالِقِينَ, so he only uses the word تَبَارَكَ for himself, which is from Bab al-Mufa'ala. There must be a difference between the two. The difference is that whenever someone else is mentioned, that barakat is not zati, it's arazi, meaning it is acquired, it is borrowed. But when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks of barakat for himself, it is something which is zati, and he is the mansha, and he is the source of all of the barakat. So when he says, تَبَارَكَ الَّذِي بِيَدِهِ الْخَيْرِ بِيَدِهِ الْمُلْكِ وَهُوَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٍ, don't look at the barakat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala like you would look at the barakat of anyone else. But this is where we understand, while Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is keeping this barakat to himself and exclusively his, because it emerges from him, but we have those zawat muqaddasa Ahl-e-Bait alayhi wasallam, who are the manifestation of the barakat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Salawat bi Muhammad wa alihi. So this barakat of Allah is maqsoos bi zat-e ilahi. Number 2 in this ayat, after he says Tabarak al-Lazi, he says Biyadihil Mulk. What is Biyadihil Mulk? that in his hand is the mulk. There's word mulk and there's word milk, not the English milk. Milkiyat, right? That which you own. So you own a house, you own a car, you own different things. Today you own it, tomorrow someone else will own it. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Malikul Mulk. Right? So here comes the difference. Therefore, when he says Biyadihil Mulk, there's a possibility someone might say, you and I, when we say we have this in our hands, it is understandable because we have hands. You know, every ayat of Quran, this is why we rely on the tafsir of Muhammadu Ali Muhammad. Because their tafsir is Ain Tawheed. You will not find Tawheed anywhere the way Ahl-e-Bait have explained it to us. We said, Biyadihil Mulk is a possibility someone might say that you and I can relate to this because we have hands. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how does he have hands? You know, well, there are ayat of Quran that talk about the false beliefs of certain individuals. When they accuse Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when they used to say that Yadullah maghlula, hands of Allah are tied up. Hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are tied up. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was asking them to give in His way. He said, when you give in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He said, look, Allah is in need. That's why He's asking you to give. Look at the Sada Allah, the person who's looking at it from a very, shallow perspective. That Allah is in need. That's why He's asking, Man dalladhi yuqridu Allah qardan hasana. Who will loan Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala qardan hasana? That means what? Allah is in need of it. So therefore they said what? Yadullah maghlula. How hands of Allah are tied up. The response came. He said, no. Bal yadahu mabsutatan. Not only that Allah's hands are not tied up, your hands are tied up, but hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are wide open, and He does khair with His hands wide open. One thing becomes clear over here. Every type of khair is done with the hands that are wide open. You cannot do khair with your hands tied up. Similarly, hayya ala khair al-amal cannot be done with hands that are tied up. Salawat bi Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So here it says, well, Allah has hands. How does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have hands? This is those ayat which are referred to in Quran as mutashabihat. So when you run into mutashabihat in Quran, what do you need to see? The muhkamat in Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not just send us mutashabihat in Quran, rather along with mutashabih, ambiguous. Mutashabih means ambiguous. There's certain ayat of Quran that might be ambiguous to you. You may not understand them fully. That is okay. That is the reason Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said this Quran needs hadi along with it. We're not the believers who raise the slogan Hasbuna Kitabullah. The book of Allah is enough. No, book of Allah is not enough. If there's no hadi along with it, to go out and explain this book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because this very book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could be misleading. And you have seen that in the Battle of Siffin, how this book was misleading to many people. They fell for this book. They saw it raised on top of the spears. They said, we cannot fight with those who are raising Quran on top of the spears. How can we fight with those who are bringing Quran along with them? How can we fight those who are hafizan al-Quran? As you were looking at Quran from the very shallow perspective while Quran al-Natiq was standing in front of you. You fell for Quran al-Samit, which cannot defend itself, and you did not see Quran al-Natiq standing over there. And therefore we understand that these ayat muhkamat are present in Quran. So when you run into ayat mutashabih which says Yadullah maghlula or Yadullah fawqa aydihim, God's hands are on top of their hands. One thing is clear, the word hands is not being used in a physical sense. hands is being used metaphorically. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not have these physical features that you and I do. He said, that's just your claim. There are many amongst the Muslim sects who believe the bodily parts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Their fuqaha have explained when Allah is sitting on the arsh ilahi. Ala al-arsh istawa. God is sitting on His throne, and then the person showed, this is how I'm sitting on this throne. Allah is sitting. And then this is how He comes down, and this is how He goes up. The kayfiyat is unknown to us. But iman that Allah has body parts is musallam. And if you question about it, that is bidat. So all doors are closed for you. You have to bring iman onto it, that Allah has body. You cannot question the kayfiyat of it. Why? Because it will become bid'ah. This madhab does not have any dead ends. This madhab has answered all of these questions. These ayat should not be taken in a literal sense. They are metaphorically used. Do you and I not use this? That the reins of the country is in this person's hands. Or this election is in this person's hands. I'm speaking in kinaya. That this person holds everything in their own hands. Literally, is it in their hands? No. Hands here refers to the qudurat, taqat, and the power of that individual. Therefore, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the word yad for Himself, it is not in literal sense. That is, of course, a common belief. But you need proof from Quran. You go ahead and look at those ayat, which are muhkamat. Very simple ayat. Simple in a sense that we all know this ayat, but it's not a simple ayat. قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. Or towards the end when it says لَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. Or when it says لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ. Nothing is like Him. He is one, indivisible. These ayat refer to the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not like you and I. The Prophet and Aimma were not like you and I. How can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be like you and I? Salawat Haji Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So far we've established what does the word tabaraka means. We also now understand what is the difference between mulk and milk. And we also know that the word yad, why is it being used the way it is being used. Then he says, تبارك الذي في يده الملك وهو على كل شيء قدير الذي خلق الموت والحياة. Allah, that Tabarak wa Ta'ala, is someone who created maut and hayat. A very common question that arises over here is that a khilqat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is something which is visible to us. Although that could be relative and that could be questionable as well. But nonetheless, when it comes to looking at hayat and maut, we see hayat, don't we? When we see people walking around, we see that they are hayy. And maut is something which we do not see. So how is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls Himself to be the creator of maut and hayat? Maut is something which is visible. Hayat is something which is visible. It makes sense for hayat to be a creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a khilqat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a makhluk of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How can maut be a makhluk of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? That's where this question arises. There's a possibility that maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is referring to maut as His creation in the sense that not maut itself. Because you're looking at maut as something which is lack of life. Lack of life is maut. So how can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala create lack of life? Life He creates. Lack of life, how does He create that? Because you're looking at maut like this, it is possible that muqaddimat of maut are the things that Allah is referring to. The khilqat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not maut, but the muqaddamah of maut. Now what is the muqaddamah of maut? that which preludes maut, that which comes before maut, that which is a prerequisite of the maut. For example, someone getting sick, for example, someone getting ill, something happening to them, that is something which is visible. That could be the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are all people thinking, sitting down, looking at the Quran, looking at the ayat, diving into it, pondering upon it. It's good to ponder. But Ma'asumeen have given us a very straightforward understanding when it comes to Quran. He says, Man fassara al-Qur'ana bi-ra'yihi falyatabawwa'hu maq'adahu an-nar. Whoever does the tafsir of Quran based on their own whims and their own opinions, their final abode is Jahannam. Very straightforward. Don't start doing the tafsir of Quran according to your own understanding. Oh, I think this is what it means. I think this is what it means. That's actually a big mistake on part of us as well sometimes. When we question, where does it say in Quran that we have to do this? You get this question. I'm not talking about from non-Muslims. I'm not talking about from غير mu'min. I'm talking about from mu'mineen. When you tell them about something, right away they question, where is it in the Quran? For example, when you tell them the wujub of khums, they say, where does it say in Quran that we have to pay khums? The first answer is, of course, it says there in Quran. Number one, you should be asking this question when you have read the entire Quran and you have memorized the entire Quran and all of the 6,000 ayat are right in front of you. Only then you should be questioning, where does it say in Quran? Because I know the entire Quran. For example, someone sent you an email and he mentioned something about it. He said, where does it say in the email? I read the whole thing. It doesn't say anywhere. Then you have the ability to question. When you don't even comprehend the entire Quran and what's in it, how can you go ahead and say, where does it say in Quran? Number one, we don't completely rely only on Quran when it comes to our wajibat and muharramat. We have other things upon which we rely. Again, going back to the same point, we are not the followers of those who say, Hasbuna kitabullah. Because if the book of Allah was enough for us, then many of the wajibat will not be fulfilled today. Very basic question. I'm speaking to my kids children over here. That when they question, why do we have to pray? Where does it say in Quran how to pray? It doesn't say anywhere in Quran how to pray. It doesn't. Only it says, Aqimus Salah, establish the prayer. But it doesn't say anywhere how to pray the Salah. It doesn't mention Takbiratul Ihram, does not mention the Ruku and the Sujood and the Shahud and Salam. None of those things are mentioned. But you still pray or no? You do. Where did you get all that from? You got all that from the Kalam of Masumeen alayhi salatu. So when it comes to your prayer, you got that from the Kalam of Masumeen. When it comes to other wajibat, you say, show it to me in Quran. That means we become amongst those يُؤْمِنُونَ بِعْبَعَدْ وَيَكْفُرُونَ بِبَعْض. Those who believe in some portion of this book and they decline on the other portion of the book. So therefore, looking at it from this perspective, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He says that He created maut and hayat, we should take His words. We should not question it. And then we ask Imam Masoom, what does that mean? Because our minds cannot reach that maqam. This is where we deny the need of an imam is necessary in order to understand the ayat of Quran. And anyone who does the tafsir of Quran on their own, maq'adahu fin nar. So what does Imam say? He said, why are you looking at maut to be annihilation, non-existent? When you look at maut to be nisti wa nabudi, only then you have a question that how can Allah create something which is non-existent? Maut is not non-existent. In the belief of a mu'min, maut is ayn hayat. Maut exists. Why? Maut is a transition for you from this life to the hereafter. Maut is not something which you might believe or some believe that maut is lack of hayat, that it doesn't exist. So if it doesn't exist, how can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala create this maut? No, it exists. but it is different from your perspective. You thought maut was annihilation and death was non-existence. No, death is your continuation of your life. That's why our language, you should be proud of the language. Sometimes the word that is used in it is intiqal. To be what? Muntaqil, from one place to another place, is what? Maut is. Salawat bi Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Fourth Imam Ali ibn Hussein, Zayn al-Abidin, alayhi salam, was asked, what is maut? What is maut? Again, you ask the Masumin. They will explain to you. The way Allah says He created maut and hayat, and we ask Imam, what is maut? Sif lana al-maut, mal maut. Imam responded, there's a different view. When it comes to mu'min, maut is different. When it comes to kafir, maut is different. What is it to mu'min? He said, qala, لِلْمُؤْمِنِ كَالنَّزْعِ ثِيَابٍ وَسِخَةٍ قَمِلَةٍ وَفَكِّ قُيُودٍ وَأَغْلَالٍ ثَقِيلَةٍ. He said, for a believer, it is like removing dirty clothes, taking off clothes which have become dirty and infested, and releasing oneself from the heavy chains and shackles. When you're able to relieve yourself from dirty clothes and get into newer clothes, how do you feel at that time? When imagine you are in shackles and those shackles are removed from you. There was some shackles on your neck and on your shoulders and your feet. Imagine someone says, let me open this up and relieve you of that. How would you feel? Many of us may not have faced that, so we don't know how it feels. But you can understand, if you're dragging tawf, and if you're dragging, ropes and shackles in your body, it's very difficult. Your movement is limited. But the moment all of those things are removed from you, what happens to you? You become free. Imam said, it is as if for a mu'min, it is removing dirty clothes. It's removing the heavy chains and shackles, and the exchange for the finest garments and the most pleasant fragrance, and as well as the mounts are concerned, the smoothest of the riqab upon which a person rides. This is what maut is. This is what maut is. It is as if a person is traveling from qaid toward azadi. It is as if a person is being relieved from a prison in which he was not allowed to speak or breathe. Now he's being released by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He said, for mu'min, maut is as such. But of course, وَلِلْ كَافِرِ كَخَلْعِ ثِيَابٍ فَاخِرَةٍ وَالنَّقْلِ عَنْ مَنَازِلٍ أَنِيسَةٍ وَاسْتِبْلَالِ بِأَوْسَخِ الثِّيَابِ وَخْشَنِهَا. And for the disbeliever, it is like removing the fine garments and being transferred from the pleasant places and being replaced to the filthiest and the roughest of the places. That is the difference between mu'min and kafir as far as maut is concerned. So if maut in your perspective is a brightening, is sin's perspective according to Aimai Athar, then you should not be fearful of maut. Rather, you should be embracing this maut. Salawat bi Muhammad wa ala. Couple more things. I have not even gotten into other aspects of just explaining the ayah to you. It says, خَلَقَ الْمَوْتَ وَالْحَيَاةَ. First he mentions maut, and then he mentions hayat. That itself requires in-depth analysis as to why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is so stuck up on maut, and then he talks about hayat afterwards. As if something that comes first has more importance in certain senses. Maybe in shairi or in other areas, it might have different perspective. But usually something that is mentioned first is what? More valuable. I know it's not time for it, but I just remembered those of you who are have some shawq of adabiyat. If you have read Mushtaq Ahmad Yusufi, in one of his books, he is explaining the different cities in Pakistan. And he talks about, maybe it's Darguzasht, I think in Darguzasht probably. He talks about different cities in Pakistan. He mentions, Islamabad, he mentions Lahore, he mentions Sialkot, for example, Faisalabad, for example, Quetta, for example. Then he mentions Karachi. He said Karachi is this, Karachi is that. He was originally from Karachi. And it's a beautiful city, it's got lights and this and that, the Mazar-e-Qaid and all that stuff. And then he kept Lahore for the end. Which means what? Which means that he kept the best for the last. He said Lahore is a great city, it's got Minar-e-Pakistan, the city belongs to Allama Iqbal. All of the things, the merits that he could mention, taking you to the heights. And then he says, Lahore would have been much better if it was in Karachi. Sorry to those who are from Lahore. Sadhu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. But here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions what? He mentions Maut first, and then Hayat. So that means what? Maut comes first, then Hayat. How do we reconcile that? You look at other ayat of Quran. That's the beauty of Quran. That ba'aduhu yufassiru ba'dah. Some of the ayat do the tafsir of the other ayat of Quran. For example, another place in Quran, when you read, it says, كَيْفَ تَكْفُرُونَ بِاللَّهِ. How do you go ahead and deny Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? وَكُنْتُمْ أَمْوَاتًا فَأَحْيَاكُمْ. You were non-existent. You were amwat. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought you to this life. Over there as well, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about His that how can you deny the wujud of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? He brings maut first and then he talks about hayat. Another interesting point over here is that how, it is difficult that many people did not believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In fact, I had mentioned before as well that even our Prophet, Hazrat Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, that people were so quick to take anyone to be their gods, it would have been easy for Rasulullah to proclaim to be a god, because it was difficult for him to proclaim to be Nabi and people follow him. And then to introduce Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have easily threatened people that if you don't believe in me, I will kill you all. I'll take your life. I've given you this life. I'll take your life the moment you deny His existence. He didn't do that. That's where we see the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He said, لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا. I've created you. I've given you this life. I'm not going to take away just because you are in denial of my wujud. Similarly, Rasulullah could have easily claimed to be God if he wanted. People would have believed in him. Why? Because people used to worship the sun at that time. Rasulullah is someone who did Raddu Shams. People used to worship the moon. Rasulullah is someone who did Shaqqul Qamar, who did not believe in someone who can divide the moon. People used to believe and worship the stars. Rasulullah was able to call the star down to earth. People used to worship in front of the trees. Rasulullah pointed to a tree, it came forward. Then it said, go back, it went back. People used to worship the stones. Rasulullah made the stones talk on his hand. He produced all of these miracles. Wouldn't it have been easier for him to go ahead and declare Rububiyyat instead of Nubuwwat? Because people weren't believing in him as a Nabi, they would have believed in him as a Rabb. Rasulullah but did not go ahead and make such a claim. He said the power, the ability that is there in the bandagi of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not there in the false deity. It's not there. And therefore I'm not going to declare to be Rabb or Khuda. I am Bandae Khuda. Salawat bi Muhammad wa alayhi. He says, لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا. He did not say لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَكْثَرُ عَمَلًا. I'm out of my time, almost. I'm out in 10 minutes. That we created you is the maqsad khilqat. As Allah said, لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ. After having said, الَّذِي خَلَقَ الْمَوْتَ وَالْحَيَاةَ لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ. We created maut and hayat so that لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ, right? Lam here is for ta'aleem. So that we may test you. Is the maqsad of creation and life tests? No. Testing is not the maqsad of hayat. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not send us in this world so that He could just test us, that He could just put us into trials. That is not the maqsad of the khilqat of mankind, or any creation for that matter. You all know the maqsad of hayat. Surah Zariyat talks about it. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. We did not create insan and jinn except that they may what? Worship us. That is maqsad hayat. That is maqsad maut. So that you may worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you attain this qurb ilahi, when you go through the difficulties in life and you remain steadfast by continuing to seek the qurb and the nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is the maqsad of creating this maut and hayat, not just the difficulties that you face in life. These difficulties should actually be just overlooked. Sometimes when we come across difficulties, we start to make noise. We start to, show faza' and jaza'. A beautiful riwayah said, if you do jaza' in front of, if you complain in front of maut, will you be able to turn it back around? Will there be anything that comes back? It's, what should we do? It's a sabr. Sabr is the key when it comes to the difficulty of maut. There's nothing more difficult than maut. And even on maut, you should be what? Sabir. Why? Because when you show sabr, number one, jaza and faza will not bring it back. Number two, when you do sabr, not only that you have agreed to the decree of Allah, but you're also rewarded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore we see the display of immense amount of sabr in Karbala. Karbala mein sabr ki buland tareen misalein mawjood hain. Bas waqt mein zyada gunjaish nahi hai, chand jumle aur zahmat tamam. Tazkira aapne marsiye mein suna, سید الشہداء کے صبر کا اندازہ لگائے. کیا صبر ہے سید الشہداء؟ وہ شخص کہ جو صبح سے لاشیں اٹھا ایک ایک کر کے لاشوں کو لاتا ہے تاکہ خیمے کے ساتھ رکھتے جا رہے ہیں. پہلے اصحاب جاتے رہے تو کم از کم یہ سہارا تھا کہ امام کے پاس بنو ہاشم کے جوان موجود تھے. ان کے ساتھ جاتے تھے. کبھی حبیب کے لاشے کو لے کے آئے, کبھی مسلم ابن اوسجہ کے لاشے کو لے کے آئے, کبھی دیگر اصحاب کی لاشوں کو لائے. ایک ایک کر کے لاشوں کو لاتے تھے. امام علیہ السلام اور بنو ہاشم کے جوان وہاں موجود تھے. لیکن ایک وقت وہ آیا کہ جب بنو ہاشم کے جوان بھی اس دنیا سے چلے گئے. اب حسین ابن علی تک و تنہا کس طریقے سے ان لاشوں کو اٹھاتے رہے. سید الشہداء صبح سے یہ سلسلہ چل رہا ہے. دھوپ ہے, بھوک ہے, پیاس ہے. صرف بچے ہی علاتش نہیں کر رہے تھے. امام حسین زبان سے شاید علاتش نہ کر رہے ہوں مگر دل میں تو علاتش تھا. حسین کی زبان بھی سوکھی ہوئی تھی. اس کا تو مظاہرہ بھی آپ دیکھ چکے تھے جب علی اکبر کے منہ میں امام نے اپنی زبان رکھی تھی. تو ایک دفعہ علی اکبر نے اپنی زبان کھینچ دی تھی کہ بابا آپ کے ہونٹ, آپ کی زبان تو مجھ سے بھی زیادہ خشک ہے. تو وہ حسین جو اس قدر بھوک اور پیاس کے عالم میں ہے, اور وہ حسین جو صبح سے لے کے لاشوں کو اٹھا رہا ہے, کس طرح کا کمال صبر ہے حسین ابن علی میں کہ امام اس کام کو انجام دیتے رہے. کیوں؟ خدا کی راہ میں یہ کام انجام دیا جا رہا ہے. اسی لیے آپ نے اکثر سنا ہے کہ جب امام حسین نے وہ بڑی مشکل شہادت پیش کی, ہاں جب جوان جاتے تھے تو سمجھ میں آتی تھی بات کہ جو جوان جا رہا ہے جنگ کرے گا, اپنے پاؤں پہ چل کے گیا ہے, جنگ کرے گا, شہید ہو جائے گا. لیکن وہ جو گھٹنے بھی نہیں چل سکتا ہے, ششماہا ہے, امام جب اس کو اپنے ہاتھوں پہ لے کے گئے ہیں اور اس کی شہادت کا نذرانہ جب پیش کیا ہے نا امام نے, تو امام نے وہ تاریخی جملے ادا کیے. امام نے کہا کوئی سوچے گا کہ کیا صبر تھا امام حسین کا کہ ششماہے کو ہاتھ میں اٹھایا ہوا تھا, جب پانی نہ ملا تو زمین پہ رکھ دیا تو سیگوشہ تیر آ کے پیوست ہو گیا, خون کا فوارہ بلند ہوا. کیا صبر تھا امام حسین ابن علی کا. مگر امام نے جواب وہی دے دیا تھا, حَوِّنْ عَلَيَّ بِأَنَّهُ بِعَيْنِ اللَّهِ. یہ کام میرے لیے بہت آسان ہے کہ میرا خدا دیکھ رہا ہے. ارے رب حسین دیکھ رہا تھا, لہذا حسین یہ کام انجام دیتے رہے. بس وہ آخری منزل آئی, آخری مرحلہ آیا, امام نے سب سے ودا کر دیا. ایک دفعہ امام مقتل میں پہنچے, امام نے اتمام حجت کے لیے بیان کر دیا کہ میں کون ہوں, لیکن کسی کے اوپر کوئی اثر نہ ہوا. کہا لِأَنَّ بُطُونَكُمْ مُلِئَتْ بِالْحَرَامِ, اس لیے کہ تمہارے بطن حرام سے بھرے ہوئے ہیں. ارے حسین کی بات کا تم میں یقین نہ آئے گا. بس امام نے جنگ کی, آخری وقت تک جنگ کی. 2000 کے قریب امام نے واصل جہنم کیے, لیکن حسین کب تک لڑتے. ندائے آسمانی آئی, اوفو بالعقود یا ایھا الذین آمنوا اوفو بالعقود یا ایھا النفس المطمئنہ ارجعی الی ربک راضیۃ مرضیہ فادخلی فی عبادی وادخلی جنتی. حسین نے تلوار رکھی, تمام جانب سے انا للہ و انا الیہ راجعون. بارے اللہ ہمیں اس بات کو گناہگار ہمارے گناہوں سے درگزر فرما. ہمیں اہل بیت علیہ السلام کے نقش قدم چلنے کی توفیق عطا فرما. ہمیں ان کی تعلیمات پر عمل کرنے کی توفیق عطا فرما. ہمارے امام کی ظہور میں تعجیل فرما. ہمیں ان کے اعوان و انصار میں شمار کر. ایک دفعہ سورہ فاتحہ کی تلاوت کر کے مرحوم شہریار حیدر